The classroom fell silent in a way that didn't feel normal. It wasn't the quiet of focus or discipline, but the kind of silence that settles after something cruel has already been said. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the wooden desks, but it did nothing to warm the atmosphere. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Hargrove, her lips curled in a thin, disapproving line, holding a test paper between two fingers as if it were something unpleasant. And in the third row, clutching the edge of her desk, sat 12-year-old Anaya, her eyes fixed downward as if looking up might shatter what little strength she had left. Some students, Mrs. Hargrove had said moments earlier, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air, clearly don't have the support at home to succeed. Her gaze had landed squarely on Anaya. And it shows. The words didn't just sting, they burned. They echoed in Anaya's ears long after the other students had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few glanced at her with pity, others with awkward curiosity, but no one spoke. No one ever did. If you believe kindness and second chances still matter in this world, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to LifeLine Tales. Because stories like this remind us how powerful even a small act of compassion can be. Anaya lived with her father, Ryan, in a small, sunlit apartment on the edge of the city. Their home wasn't big, but it was filled with quiet resilience. Ryan worked long hours as a mechanic, his hands always carrying the scent of oil and metal, his back often aching from the strain of lifting and fixing. But every evening, no matter how tired he was, he would sit beside Anaya at their small kitchen table, helping her with homework he barely understood, encouraging her in ways no one else did. Life had not been gentle with them. Anaya's mother had passed away when she was only 6, leaving behind a silence that never fully faded. Since then, Ryan had been both father and mother, provider and comforter, doing everything he could to fill the gaps left behind. But there were limits to what he could give, and education was one of those areas where he struggled. He hadn't finished school himself, and while he tried his best, the textbooks often felt like a language he no longer spoke. At school, Anaya tried to hide that struggle. She listened carefully, took notes, stayed quiet, and avoided attention. But her grades told a story she couldn't control. They weren't terrible, but they weren't good enough for someone like Mrs. Hargrove, who believed excellence was the only acceptable outcome. The day of the incident, the humiliation had spread beyond that one moment. Whispers followed Anaya through the hallways, subtle but sharp. By lunchtime, she sat alone, pushing food around her plate, her appetite gone. The sunlight outside seemed too bright, too cheerful, as if mocking the heaviness in her chest. That afternoon, when she returned home, Ryan noticed immediately. He always did. There was something about the way she dropped her bag, the way she avoided eye contact, that told him everything without a single word being spoken. He didn't push her right away. Instead, he prepared tea, the way her mother used to, letting the quiet settle before gently asking what was wrong. And when Anaya finally spoke, her voice trembling, recounting every word Mrs. Hargrove had said, something shifted in Ryan's expression. It wasn't anger, not the loud kind. It was something deeper, more controlled, like a storm held tightly beneath the surface. That night, after Anaya had gone to bed, Ryan sat alone at the kitchen table. The same table where they studied, where they laughed, where they tried to build a life from the pieces they had. He stared at her textbooks, running his fingers over the pages as if trying to absorb the knowledge through touch alone. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he made a decision. The next morning marked the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. Ryan adjusted his work schedule, taking fewer hours despite the financial strain it would bring. During the day, while Anaya was at school, he began visiting a local community center that offered adult learning classes. It wasn't easy. Sitting in a classroom again after so many years felt uncomfortable, almost humiliating at times. He struggled with basic concepts, stumbled over words, and often felt out of place among younger learners. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered Anaya's face in that classroom, the way she had been made to feel small. And that memory pushed him forward. Meanwhile, at school, Anaya continued to endure the quiet pressure. Mrs. Hargrove didn't repeat her public criticism, but her expectations hung heavily in the air. Every assignment, every test felt like a test not just of her knowledge, but of her worth. Still, something inside Anaya had begun to change. Her father's quiet determination, though unspoken, seemed to reach her in subtle ways. She noticed him studying late at night, his brow furrowed in concentration, his exhaustion evident but ignored. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her struggle. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next, but beneath the surface, something was building. Ryan learned quickly, driven by purpose rather than obligation. He began to understand the material Anaya was studying, breaking it down in ways that made sense to both of them. Their evenings transformed from quiet frustration into moments of shared discovery. They laughed over mistakes, celebrated small victories, and slowly, steadily, progress began to take shape. By the fourth day, Anaya's confidence had grown in ways no one at school could see. She raised her hand once in class, her voice hesitant but clear. Mrs. Hargrove noticed, surprised but silent. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to shift something in the room. And then came the fifth day. The morning sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the school grounds. It was presentation day, a chance for students to showcase their understanding of the week's lessons. For most, it was routine. For Anaya, it felt like standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. When her name was called, she stood slowly, her heart pounding. The classroom seemed larger than usual, the silence heavier. She walked to the front, clutching her notes, her hands trembling slightly. But then she remembered something. The nights at the kitchen table. Her father's tired eyes lighting up when she finally understood a concept. The quiet pride in his voice when he said, "You've got this." And suddenly, the fear didn't disappear, but it became manageable. Anaya began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, but steady. She explained the topic with clarity, breaking it down step by step, her understanding deeper than it had ever been before. As she continued, something remarkable happened. The room leaned in. Students who had once ignored her now listened. Even Mrs. Hargrove's expression began to change, her skepticism slowly giving way to surprise. By the time Anaya finished, the silence returned, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was filled with something else. Respect. Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Anaya. For a moment, it seemed as though she might say something critical, something dismissive. But instead, she paused. Truly paused. And then, quietly, she acknowledged the effort. Not with grand praise, not with exaggerated enthusiasm, but with something far more meaningful. Recognition. It wasn't just the teacher who had changed in that moment. It was the entire narrative. What no one in that classroom fully understood was the journey behind those 5 days. The sacrifices, the late nights, the quiet resilience of a father who refused to let his daughter believe she was anything less than capable. When Anaya returned home that afternoon, she didn't need to say much. Ryan saw it in her eyes, in the way she smiled, a real smile, one that hadn't been there in days. And in that moment, everything they had worked for felt worth it.